Good morning, folks, and welcome back to another Teaching Sound Doctrine Bible class. As always, we want to thank you for being here. I appreciate your patience over the last 3 weeks since I was kind of in a little bit of a physical bind and what have you. I appreciate your patience with me. We want to start a 4-part lesson today with part 1 of Fear God. Now, as always, my email address is at the top of every transcript, and those can be found on the website along with the video of each lesson. So you're more than welcome to go to our website, jfmiller.com/online class. And there you'll find all the videos, all the transcripts, and other material that you might find useful in your study of God's Word. Now, something that I believe we don't hear much about anymore is the fear of God, whether it be literal or whether it be as in honoring God, to be fearful, to be reverent of God. So you see, one of the most impressive concepts in the Bible is that of walking in fear of God. And the more I study and see how that expression, the fear of God, is used, the more determined I am to encourage others to walk in the fear of the Lord. Fear has to be taught. Deuteronomy 4:10 and 14:23 and Psalms 34:11 point this out. It is not casually absorbed. If one fears God, he has been taught to fear. Thus, if our children are going to walk in the fear of God, it will be because we have taught them. Now, I find myself using the expression more and more to describe those who are truly dedicated to God. I am very selective in my use of that expression. I do not use it to describe everyone who has been baptized or attends church all of the time or whatever. Not all of those who are members where we worship are walking in the fear of God. Sometimes when we're trying to figure out why someone doesn't live as they should or do better than they are doing, it would do us well to make excuses and simply conclude that they don't fear God. Well, that's not always so, but our object in this study is pretty much twofold. Number one, we want to help us to walk in the fear of God, and number two, we want to challenge us to do deeper study on the concept of fear. Now, let's look at some examples of those who feared God. Some in the Bible either described themselves or were described by God as standing in fear of God. When Abraham was about to slay his son, as God had instructed, he was stopped by an angel saying, "Now I know that you fear God." Genesis chapter 22 and verse 12. Joseph told his brothers, "Do this and live, for I fear God." That's Genesis chapter 42 and verse 18. Jonah told those aboard the ship that he was on, "I fear the Lord." Look at Jonah chapter 1 verse 9. Nehemiah described the remnant that returned as your servants who desire to fear your name. Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 11. Now later in the book, he describes Hananiah, the leader of the citadel, as a faithful man and feared God more than many. Nehemiah chapter 7 verse 2. Now this does not mean that only those whose names are associated with the term fear are those that fear God. The Bible is filled with examples of those who feared God, but other terms were used to describe their faithfulness. it's the purpose and summation of life. Solomon sought the answer to the question of the purpose of life after finding the emptiness of wealth, pleasure, and wisdom. He concluded, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13. The same writer said that we should be in the fear of God all day long. Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 17. God placed man on earth to fear him and keep his commandments. That means everything else is secondary to that. You see, our purpose and our function in life is not to work and make a living. We work and make a living so we can live and serve God with fear. Since the above is true, then if we fail to fear God, we have failed in life. If fearing God is our purpose in life, then when we don't fear, our life has no purpose. If we don't teach our children to fear God, then we have failed miserably as parents. You would no more let your child touch a hot stove than anything. I mean, why would you let your child do that? Well, that's, so you put a good, healthy fear of that hot stove in their minds so that they understand the danger. So those who fear God, what do? They please God. Peter said, but in every nation, whoever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him. Acts chapter 10 and verse 35. The familiar promise that the Lord's eyes are over the righteous and his ears are open to their prayers, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 12, was quoted from Psalm 34, verse 15, which is a description of the blessings that those who fear God receive. That would be in verse 9. Well, let's try to understand what fear means. You see, some have limited the concept of the fear of God. Some say or think that fear only involves being afraid of God. Others may think that the sense of fear has no part in service of God. However, the fear of God is like a coin. It has two sides. While those two sides are different, they are also inseparable. Now, this involves, one, being afraid of displeasing God. When Saul and Samuel were gathering men to go to battle, they took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent messengers out, each carrying a bloody piece of meat. Their message was, whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so it shall be done to his oxen. What reaction would you have had to that? I would have been afraid not to be honest with you. Now the text says, and the fear of the Lord fell on all the people, and they came out with one's consent. 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 7. Thus, they feared God in the sense that they were afraid not to do what they were told. And that's the way it should be with every Christian today. We should be afraid of not doing what God says do. The Lord says that he will look on the one who trembles at my word, Isaiah 66, verse 2. David says, my flesh trembles for the fear of you, and I am afraid of your judgments, Psalm 119, verse 120. We ought to tremble in our boots at the thought of doing the things that displease God. Paul said that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 31. The reason is our God is a consuming fire. Simply read Hebrews chapter 12, verse 29. One who can knowingly do wrong and not be bothered at all, obviously, does not fear God. Now, the second thing, respect and awe of God. When Jesus raised the son of the widow of Nain, fear came upon the people. Luke chapter 7, verse 16. There is no indication that they were afraid of anything. Rather, they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people in verse 16. Their fear was that of awe and homage and respect. When Jonah said he feared God, explained, saying, I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and dry land, in Jonah 1:9, chapter 1, verse 9. He stood in awe and wonder of God. You see, Moses also instructed the people to fear this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God. Read Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 58. So now let's consider now what that fear will cause us to do. Okay? Do what God says. While we do not live under the Old Testament, according to Galatians chapter 3, verse 24 and 25, or 2 Corinthians 3, books like Deuteronomy, which emphasize obedience to the law, serve also to demonstrate the relationship of the fear of God to obedience. Notice that connection in the following passages. That you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 2. Therefore, ye shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 6. You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him, and shall keep his commandments and obey his voice, and you shall serve him and hold fast to him. Deuteronomy chapter 13 and verse 4. And it shall be with him that he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of his law and these statutes. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 19. And lastly, if you fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice, and do not rebel against the commandments of the Lord. 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 14. Now, the one who fears God will obey to the utmost, as Abraham did. In his attempt to sacrifice Isaac in Genesis chapter 22, verse 12, when God saw he was willing to go that far in obedience, he said, now I know that you fear God. This obedience with no excuse, questions, or doubt. Now that's what we need to have. You know, we are so eager to think of fear as being the reverence of God and all of that, but we fail to actually literally fear God. Look, fear not those that, you know, can kill you, but fear God, who's going to kill you and keep you dead in hell, you know, because of your actions, because of your lack of fear, because of your lack of understanding, because you want things your way. Our job is to want things to be done in God's fashion. We're having this discussion today over closing the church buildings. I mean, you got to make a choice. Do you fear God and keep his commandments, or do you do what man says? It's really simple. It really is. And just as we try to instill a fear of God into our children, or a fear of things such as being burned by a hot stove or whatever, that's the kind of fear we need to instill not only in our children, but we need to have instilled in our own lives. So we're going to leave this lesson here for the moment. We're going to pick up with part 2 next week. Now, the next week and the following week are probably going to be shorter lessons than this one, but they're just as important, and they go right along with learning the proper use of the fear of God. I'll tell you, I'm a firm believer that it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, because if I'm not fulfilling what he wants me to do, then I'm dooming myself, and so are you. So let's leave it here. I hope you've gotten a lot out of this lesson, and I pray that you will go back and re-listen to it, that you will pick up the transcript and study it. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. And until then, may God bless.